Building a motor pattern is an ongoing process, and it is not a perfect process. In fact, as we've learned earlier, sometimes the mistakes we make help us learn that little bit faster. So making mistakes is important too. This brings us now to fault spotting. So if you remember the circle of coaching awesomeness, we begin with a perfect demonstration of a perfect biomechanical model. Then we move around that clock face, if you like, and we move to observing a fault. Now we must observe a fault before we can offer feedback so that improvements can be made. So the next thing we've got to do is we have to observe the fault. So what effectively we've got is we've got over here, we've got the perfect biomechanical model, and following on from the module that you've done on observation, we've got what you observe the person who's doing it to be doing here. Now what we have to do is to try and figure out what the difference is between these. This is the fault gap, if you like. That's what we're going to try and observe. Once we've spotted that fault, we are then able to offer the correct type of feedback to help them improve. Now, if we think learning a skill is difficult, correcting a fault is way more difficult. Now, if you read the coaching literature, it will tell you that between 3,000 and 5,000 repetitions are required in order to correct a fault. I did a study on this back in the late 1990s myself, and I found that it was closer to 15,000. In fact, very specifically, 14,600 repetitions were required to correct a fault. And the reason for that is very, very straightforward, is because speed becomes a factor. The faster you do something, the more likely the fault is to creep back in. And that makes it more and more and more difficult. So it causes us a huge problem. It's much easier for us to do something right first time than it is to correct a fault later, which is why we take our time building the skill. Otherwise, we cause ourselves problems now. But faults will always throw themselves out, so we must be prepared to deal with them. And this is where we as coaches can really make a difference. This is where we really can make a difference to the person with whom we're working. What I'd like you to do now is to imagine I was doing a long jump like I demonstrated in the previous module. I'll demonstrate a really basic long jump onto the pole vault mat so you can have a look at what I'm talking about. You'll notice, obviously, I put the camera at the correct angle to observe the open angle so that you could spot any faults I made. Now, before we go on to the next module, what I'd like you to do is to write down anything and everything that you would do to correct me if I was making a mistake on that long jump. Now, you don't need to be an expert in long jump. That is not the point. The point is, what I'd like you to do is just write down 3 columns. What would you do? What would you actually do? You can write down anything in there. Now, what would you tell me, and when would you tell me it? Would you tell me before I do something, after, or during I'm doing something? What would you tell me? And finally, what would you show me? Would you show me something before? Would you show me something after I'd made the mistake? What would you do in between the first and second jumps in order to help me to try and do a better long jump? And by the way, that was an awful long jump. You can see why I was no good at that sport. Write down everything that you can think of, and we're going to go through this in the next module, which is forms of coaching feedback.